Hi, today we're going to be taking a look at the continuous autofocus for video on the Fujifilm X-H2S in the version 6 firmware. There has been a lot of controversy, a lot of complaining, rightfully so, I think, about how the autofocus is performing on Fujifilm's cameras with these newest firmwares that have been rolling out in the past few weeks. Before the version 6 firmware, I hadn't really taken the time to dive into how the autofocus works on the X-H2S, but I wanted to learn the system and see how it works and in what scenarios it works well in and what scenarios that it might not work well in. So I did set up a variety of test shots. I didn't test every possible parameter in terms of the tracking sensitivity and the shift speed. And of course, I wasn't able to come up with every scenario possible to test the autofocus in. It's mostly just me, sitting down, walking around, etc. And I did test out animal eye detect a little bit here and there. And I also tested the wide touch tracking mode that was implemented with this new firmware. So hopefully this will help you get an idea of the scenarios in which you can use the tracking autofocus for video and where it might not work so well, and also give you some idea about how you should set up the tracking sensitivity and the focusing speed. I also only have two Fujifilm lenses to test out. I have the Fujinon 33mm f1.4, which is on the camera now. That is one of the newer lenses that has the linear motors, and I also have the 16mm f1.4, and this is one of the older lenses that has the stepping motors. And sort of the prevailing wisdom amongst Fujifilm users is that the lenses play a big part in the autofocusing performance. And I do think that's true in certain aspects of autofocusing, but I think that the much more important factor is the camera. Let's go ahead and just take a look at these test shots, and I'll probably talk over them a little bit and just kind of share my feedback on what I'm seeing, how it's working, etc. First, I want to apologize for not clearing the screen of all the extraneous bits of information. I know it makes it distracting, so I will cut to the actual recorded image so you can see it more clearly. That way you can watch the tracking box. Tracking +2 and speed at 0 are the default settings, so I wanted to do a couple of tests at those settings. It's interesting that it was able to find me in the back of the scene, but it was not able to maintain focus. So this is the same scene, and the only difference here is that it's in multi as opposed to area. So multi is basically scanning the entire array of autofocusing points to find the subject, whereas area has a predetermined box, but when you have it on eye tracking and face tracking, it will look outside of that box, as you could see in the previous set of shots. It's interesting what the camera thinks of as an eye. When you obscure the eye, it goes to your nose instead of widening out to a bigger face tracking box, which I found interesting. Also interesting that in multi, it has never found me in the back of the scene here. So this is just another location, and back into multi-eye auto, tracking is set to +3 and speed is down to -3. So this is a stickier tracking parameter and a slower sort of like focus shifting. I thought doing things like with my hands that is more natural to do. It would be a good test, so lifting binoculars up to my face, having a drink, etc., just to see what the camera would do. And in these instances, it looks like it's pretty locked on to my face and not really shifting around. It did do sort of a body tracking box, and I was also pretty interested to see that When the cat jumped on the couch, it didn't shift to the cat, but it's just sort of slowly drifting to the very front. You can see it's focused right on that pillow and the arm of the couch. And then it quickly finds and refocuses on me. All right, same test now in area. And like I mentioned before, although it does take a little bit of time to acquire me, you can see that the area tracking box is right there in the center, but it will focus on an eye and a face that's outside of that center box. And then I had the idea to just start holding up my hand to see what it would do. You can see my hand is hitting that center box and it's still staying locked onto my eye. Although there it got fooled. So when I moved my head and my eye came close to the edge of my hand, it did shift to my hand briefly, even though the box stayed on my eye. And now I've switched to multi, so really quickly I wanted to do the same thing with my hand in the multi mode. You can see that it's staying locked onto my eye. But I think there's a little, yeah, it definitely shifted focus. It didn't really go to my hand, but it just sort of lost my face a little bit there. Staying on my face, and then my thumb, it definitely went right to my thumb. So Fuji, thumb, eye, not the same. Okay, so just a different scenario here in multi, tracking +2, speed 0, so back to the default settings. You can see that it will find a body, but with the lighting conditions, it definitely lost focus there as I went down into the dark hallway. But it's actually really good once you get into the more well-lit situation. It finds and tracks you really well. And I like multi in this scenario because it doesn't shift to the background very quickly. It kind of, like when I left the frame for a second, it kind of just stuck right there, which I think is good. And I've sped up the clip a little bit here just for the sake of time. And it lost focus right there, but it didn't really know what to focus on. So now this is the same thing, but in area, and you can see the tracking box is a little bit up into the top quadrant of that middle section. And it looks like it maintains focus here a little bit better. So I wonder if that's because it is definitely focusing on that center part as opposed to multi, which didn't know. But as you can see here, because it is an area, it kind of shifted focus when I leave frame. Yeah, it just went right to that back part because of the tracking box. I think overall it's doing a really good job tracking me as I move back and forth. And I wanted to do the same test that I did before. This is a couple days later with face only. And so this is tracking +4, speed -2. So tracking +4 is the stickiest. This should be locked on. And it's interesting how the face box will sort of shrink if you try to encroach upon it. But it does lose focus a little bit as my hand kind of moves in front of that box. Same thing here, same scenario a couple days later, but I wanted to do the tracking +4, speed -2. So tracking +4 again is locked on. What's interesting is with tracking +4, it was able to find me in that background much easier than it was previously. All right, same thing this time in multi. Takes a little while to acquire, but once it does, it stays locked on pretty well. I remember before in this scenario, this is where multi was not able to find me when I went to the background. And that was in the standard +2 setting. It's interesting that it doesn't widen out there to just go face only, because it looked like it definitely lost me for a second when I had the binoculars in front of my eye. But this time it is able to find me and focus on me. Now we're looking at the wide tracking mode. So this is with the touch box, and I'm not able to record the screen here, so I'm just going to sort of describe what's going on. For the most part, I don't remember all the settings, but what I would like to point out in this instance is how the camera needs to sort of shift around to find focus. So you can see sometimes where it's tracking this middle part of this plant, and now I'm going to shift to the background, and that looked pretty smooth. And now I'm going to come back to the foreground, and that looked pretty good. Going back to the background, and it seemed to just kind of wobble right there. So sometimes you'll see a little wobble where it'll go past the thing you tap on and then come back and hit it. Both of these look pretty good as it goes from the foreground to the background. Okay, so this is the 16mm. It's doing a pretty good job. Definitely takes some time, I think. It's not like super fluid where it'll kind of go in and out of focus a little bit, but it mostly gets back on it. And right there you can see it shifted to the background. Here I'm tracked onto that main mass of that flower in the upper left quadrant, and it's doing a pretty good job of sticking to it. And of course, this is at f1.4 to make it super difficult. Now I've tracked over to that, what's now in the middle, and it shifted to that and found it pretty well. And now I'm trying to focus on the upper right. So there, it got it and then lost it. So I think these backlit scenarios are tricky for sure. And now it's not able to reacquire focus on that, what's now in the middle part. This is what I'm tapping on. And I know this is a hard situation. There's not a lot of what are we looking at here? But it's just not finding this at all. And I'm tapping repeatedly, trying to get it to focus on that section, and it's just not getting it. And there it goes, finally got it. Okay, back to the 33mm, and this is sped up, of course, and this is doing a really good job of tracking. You can see, sometimes it has to sort of shift and reacquire, but I think, you could probably smooth this out if you slowed the shift speed down a little bit. But overall, if you give it something that's a little clearer to focus on, then it does a better job. And now shifting into that background, the bird box or whatever this is, seemed to do it pretty well. No real hiccups there. Here, when you have something that's clear and more evenly lit, I think, instead of backlit, it's sort of more front and side lit. It does a better job. Again, this is the 33mm. But you can see that there's just a little bit of pulsing as it shifts back and forth. Tapping in the Honda logo, it just doesn't smoothly go and just lock on. But I was impressed here by how well it just stuck on this Honda logo. So there's no moving in and out of focus, there's no pulsing, there's no hunting, it just stayed locked on. That's a warp stabilizer. And that was pretty good. Now this is multi in animal tracking. So this is tracking the cat's eye, and then if it doesn't see an eye, it'll widen out to the head, and then it'll widen out to the body. This is definitely a difficult situation where there's not much light hitting the cat directly. It's definitely all backlit. And I'd say for the most part here, it's doing a really good job. I don't remember what the speed and sensitivity settings are set to. There's only one brief moment. I mean, eyes are totally obscured, where it loses focus. So as I said in the beginning, this isn't really a comparison between the Fujifilm X-H2S and other camera brands. But I do want to give you a little bit of insight, or at least my opinion on how usable it is. And I think in some scenarios, it is usable, it is mostly reliable, but it is still a bit unpredictable. Like in this shot, for instance, I have it set to multi-eye tracking locked on to my right eye. So like if I were to put something in between me, my eye, and the camera, it should stay locked on. And it looks like it's doing that. If I move over a little bit more, I think it's still locked on. Let's try holding up this lens. Looks like it shifted focus, I can't really tell. It's just unpredictable. Sometimes it stays locked onto your eyes, sometimes it wants to shift to something in front, regardless of the stickiness setting, unfortunately. In these kinds of shots where you're mostly sticking to one subject that's mostly static or relatively static, I think it is reliable enough, especially if it's just YouTube videos where it's okay, you know, if the focus goes in and out a little bit. Obviously, you don't want it to be going in and out constantly. It can also be useful, like if you wanted to do things like this and hold up something in front of your face, it can be useful for that. You just have to sort of dial in the appropriate settings. If I were doing client work, or maybe I was shooting interviews and I wanted to just let the camera rip in autofocus, I think you can use it, but I wouldn't want to tell you 100% that it can be used in that scenario. Definitely would want to have multiple cameras, so in case the focus gets a little wonky, I can always cut to the other one. I would also like to have somebody who can at least monitor the camera to make sure that it's kind of doing what it's supposed to be doing. It does seem like Fuji is relying on some contrast-based focusing points to confirm focus. So when it does shift to something else, it often will just sort of like back focus really quick and then come and just sort of lock on to the focus. It needs to do that sort of confirmation shift before it really locks on. It seemed to do that regardless of whether I was using the linear 33 or the stepping 16mm. Just seems to be how Fujifilm's focusing system is working. Because of that, I think it's much less useful if you're doing sort of like narrative style filmmaking where you want to rack focus in a continuous take, because it will sort of shift and confirm as it moves from one thing to another. I also noticed that if you do it a couple of times, the camera understands where it's focusing, then it becomes more confident in just locking on to that next thing as opposed to needing to hunt in order to find it. And because of that contrast-based sort of focusing confirmation, I don't find that the touch tracking is going to be a great option for narrative filmmaking. Again, if you need to shift focus to multiple things within a take. I think it works pretty well if you want to track one thing throughout the entire take, as opposed to wanting to shift to different things during a take. However, like I mentioned before, if you do it a couple times, it seems to gain more confidence and not need to do that confirmation. If you're doing a shot like this and you want to maintain eye tracking on one subject, if you're doing an interview, again, I would recommend that you use the locked on setting. If you want to be able to shift the focus to another object within your take, then you might want to back off that locked on setting so that it will, move to the other thing more quickly, more assuredly. Then when it's locked on, it sort of takes a little bit longer for it to give up the focus. As far as the shift speed, I think the slower side of things makes it look a little bit more natural and helps to cover up that confirmation hunting just a little bit. If you were on like the neutral setting and above. I just think it's too fast, and it will definitely highlight that focus hunting that it tends to do. As I said, I'm not comparing this to other manufacturers. If you already have Fujifilm cameras, this is kind of what you can expect with the autofocus. If you are thinking about buying a Fujifilm camera and you want to be able to rely on continuous autofocus, if you're not 100% sold on Fujifilm for other reasons, then I don't think it's the best system for continuous autofocus for video. I think I'll leave it at that. I'd love to know how you are faring with the firmware updates, whether it's the X-H2S or the other cameras that have since gotten all of these new autofocusing updates. I'm also interested to know if you have third-party lenses, how you're finding those to work. I think that's everything. I appreciate you watching the video. Of course, if you have any other questions, comments, concerns, you know where to go, and maybe I'll see you in another video.